Monster Hunter World Iceborne is a wonderful gaming experience with a whole host of content that Capcom has supported over the past few years. But now we have access to all the game has to offer, and we can work towards the best builds possible in the game. So I'm Darcblade with the best of the best builds for the Sword and Shield in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Now when I say a best of the best build, I mean a set that is constructed from some of the rarest armour, weaponry and jewels in the game. This gives hunters some of the strongest builds possible. For this series I'll be featuring 4 builds for each of the various weapons in the game, which should cater to a variety of playstyles. When it comes to the Sword and Shield, it is the most all-round weapon, a jack of all trades weapon able to fulfill multiple roles, whether it be DPS, defensive, support or whatever you wish. The builds featured for the weapon in this video will lean more towards DPS rather than anything else, but it will also feature support and survival options for players who like to use those aspects of the game. So the first build is the best of the best raw attack Sword and Shield build. This is a build all about having high raw attack so you're able to take on monsters quickly and effectively. As you are focusing on raw attack as well and not elemental or element attacks, it means that you don't have to really take into account a monster's elemental resistances, so it can be used against pretty much any monster in the game. So on top of that, it has a ton of quality of life and defensive skills, making it a great all-round build. So for this you'll need the Brachydium Helm beta, the Dragon Hide beta, Dragon Claws beta, Dragon Barbs beta and Dragon Feet beta. I'm also using a Challenger Charm 5, and for my weapon I'm using the True Fatalis sword. This has a health regen augmentation and attack increase augmentation. As for the specialist tools, these are down to personal preference, so I've gone for temporal and rocksteady mantles. Now when it comes to the jewels, you've got a ton to play around with. Remember, if you don't have all the jewels featured here, you can swap them in and out for what you have available to you. So first of all, I've gone for flawless jewels to max out peak performance. I've then gone for protection jewels for divine blessing, critical jewels for crit boost, expert jewels for some critical eye, challenger jewels to max out the agitator's skill, evasion jewels for evade window, handicraft jewels for some extra handicraft, shaver jewels for the clutch claw boost skill, attack jewels for the attack boost skill, and a fortitude jewel for the fortify skill. As for the jewels and the mantles, these are down to personal preference, but I've simply gone for dragon jewels to add a little bit of dragon attack to the build. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 200 health and 200 stamina, regardless of if you've taken consumables or not. You have a raw attack of 547, which will be higher when you take into account peak performance being active. You have a decent chunk of purple sharpness with 15% base affinity. This can potentially be 85% affinity when you take into account the buff from agitator as well as weakness exploit. You have a dragon rating of 120 with high elder seal, and you'll have a very strong defense of 1111 that is strong against water and thunder, a little bit weak to fire and ice, and unfortunately very weak to dragon. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have attack boost at level 7. Attack boost is a skill that increases the raw attack of a build, and at level 4 or above it also provides us a bonus 5% extra affinity. You have critical eye at level 7, increasing the base affinity of this build, very useful for weapons such as the True Fatalis sword that start with negative affinity. You have agitator at level 7. Agitator is a wonderful buff that kicks in whenever a monster becomes enraged. When this happens, you'll gain increased raw attack and base affinity. And as you can easily control when a monster becomes enraged in Monster Hunter World Iceborne thanks to the whole flint shot mechanic, this buff should be active for the majority of a hunt. You'll also have Evade Window at level 5, a wonderful defensive skill. Evade Window gives us increased invulnerability frames when we perform dodges and such, so we can pretty much roll through attacks. This also means that with this build, we're going to be trying to avoid attacks rather than block them with our shield. But should we mess up our dodge, then we can fall back on the next skill, which is Divine Blessing at level 5. This is a skill that gives us an increased chance at taking reduced damage when we take a hit from a monster. You'll also have Critical Boost at level 3, which is a decent DPS skill that gives us increased damage whenever our attacks crit a monster. However, this damage is only applied to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental or ailment portion. You'll also have Weakness Exploit at level 3. Weakness Exploit is a skill that gives us increased affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points. And should these weak points be tenderized through clutch claw attacks first, this increase to our affinity is even greater. Weakness Exploit at level 3 can potentially provide us an extra 50% bonus affinity. You'll also have Peak Performance at level 3, which is a useful DPS skill that gives us increased raw attack whenever we have full health. This can be a difficult buff to remain active, but with the health regen augmentation and the fact that we can consume potions without having to sheath our weapon, it means that we should be able to reactivate it should we lose the buff. Anyway, you'll have Handicraft at level 2, which slightly increases the sharpness of our weapon. You also have Fortify at level 1, which is a useful skill when it comes to difficult hunts in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Fortify is a skill or buff that kicks in whenever we cart and faint. When this happens, we'll come back with increased raw attack and defense. but this buff can be applied twice to a hunter during any one mission. You also have Clutch Claw Boost level 1, which is a useful skill for light weapons that enables us to tenderize monster body parts in just one Clutch Claw attack instead of 2. And then finally, when you're wearing your mantles, you have Dragon Attack level 2, which increases the dragon rating and thus dragon damage of the weapon we're using. Finally, when it comes to the set bonus, you'll have 2 of them, both attached to the Vitalis Legend. For wearing 2 pieces of the Vitalis set, you'll get the Inheritance set bonus, which allows us to increase the level cap on certain skills. With this build, it allows us to get the Agitator skill from level 5 to level 7, ultimately increasing our DPS, and you also get the Divine Blessing skill from level 3 to a maximum of level 5, ultimately increasing our defense. And then finally, for wearing 4 pieces of the Vitalis armor, you'll have the Transcendent set bonus. This provides us 2 buffs really. Firstly, it allows us to have 200 health and 200 stamina, regardless of consumables or skills such as health boost. And on top of that, it also grants us the true Razor Sharp skill, which severely reduces our sharpness loss when we're attacking a monster. So there you have it, that is the best of the best raw attack build for the Sword and Shield I tend to use. As you can see, it is a jack of all trades build. Having a very strong offense combined with defense, it means that you can take on pretty much any monster in the game. But every build in Monster Hunter World Iceborne has pros and cons. The biggest pro for this build is its damage output. Having a ton of skills related to increasing our raw attack as well as affinity, it means that we can take on monsters quite comfortably with this build. On top of that, this build has quite a few defensive options, thanks to Evade Window, Divine Blessing and more. It all adds to our survivability when taking on the monsters in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. And then finally for the pros is the true Vitalis Legend, which gives us an increase to our defense, offense and quality of life. But unfortunately there are cons to every build out there. The 2 biggest cons for this build include there will be times where you may have sharpness issues unfortunately with this build, and the other con is this is a jewel heavy build, requiring some of the rarest jewels in the game to make work effectively. But these are supposed to be the best of the best builds, so they're going to be featuring rare jewels, weaponry and armor. But if you're looking for an all-round build, something that you can use against pretty much any monster in the game, I can strongly recommend this one. It's able to take down monsters quickly regardless of their resistances, and on top of that, it gives you the survivability to take on hunts quite comfortably. Which brings us on to our next build, which is the best of the best Elemental Sword and Shield build. This build is all about dealing elemental damage to a monster, thus you have to take into account a monster's elemental weaknesses, but if you do, and you counter them with the correct element, this build can take down monsters incredibly quickly. Just remember when it comes to the Sword and Shield to take on monsters with the sword attacks rather than the shield attacks when it comes to elemental damage. So for this build you'll need the entire Safi'jiiva armor set, which includes the Safi Crested Crown Beta, Crested Chest Alpha, Crested Vambraces Beta, Crested Belt Beta and Crested Boots Beta. I'm also using a Blaze Charm 5. You can of course swap out the Blaze Charm 5 to match whatever new element you are using if you wanted to swap out the elemental weapon. And for my weapon I'm using the Kiar Slicer King. This has a health regen augmentation and then elemental up augmentation. As for the specialist tools, once again they're down to personal preference, so I've gone for temporal and rocksteady mantles. So when it comes to the jewels, you've got a few to play around with. First of all, I've gone for a Blaze Jewel to max out the fire attack of this build. Of course, like I mentioned with the Blaze Charm, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you'd replace this Blaze Jewel to match whatever new element you were using. I've then gone for Tenderizer Jewels for weakness exploit, Evasion Jewels for evade window, Vitality Jewels for health boost, a Shaver Jewel for the Clutch Claw boost skill, Sharp Jewel for protective polish, Challenger Jewels for agitator, a Shield Jewel for the guard up skill, and then finally a Fortitude Jewel which is optional for the Fortify skill. As for the jewels on the mantles, I've gone for attack and protection jewels. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 444 with a decent chunk of white sharpness. You have 55% base affinity, which can easily be 100% when you take into account weakness exploit, with a fire rating of 840. Please note that the fire rating and base affinity shown here are with the true Dragon Vein Awakening buff in effect. You also have a decent defense of 1081 that is strong against every element except for the dragon element. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have fire attack at level 6. This is a skill that increases the fire rating and thus fire damage of this build. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, and thus changing out the Blaze Charm and the Blaze Jewel, fire attack would be replaced to match whatever new element you were using. So say you were using an ice weapon, it would be ice attack at level 6 instead of fire attack level 6. Anyway, you also have Agitator at level 5, Evade Window at level 5, you have Health Boost at level 3. Health Boost is a skill that allows us to get our maximum health to that potential 200. You have Dragon Resistance level 3, which is a byproduct of the armor we're wearing, but it's still useful. It's a defensive and quality of life skill that nullifies all elemental blights on our hunter. You have Critical Boost level 3, a reminder that critical boost only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion. You also have Weakness Exploit level 3, Fortify level 1, Guard Up level 1. Guard Up is really an optional skill and a get out of jail skill when it comes to this build. Basically, it allows our shield to block unblockable attacks, but we still want to be evading attacks more than blocking them, as we do have evade window at level 5. Nonetheless, Guard at level 1 gives us that option should we come up against an attack that is unblockable. Anyway, you have Protected Polish at level 1. Protected Polish is a useful buff that we can put on our sharpness gauge. Whenever we sharpen a weapon, we'll put a protective coating over that said sharpness gauge, preventing any sharpness loss for a small duration of time. This helps counter the small amount of white sharpness the KR weapons normally has. Anyway, next up is Critical Element at level 1. Critical Element works like Critical Boost in a way, but applies to the elemental portion of an attack. So, when our attacks crit a monster, they'll deal increased elemental damage. Next up is Clutch Claw Boost at level 1, and finally when you're wearing your mantles you'll either have Attack Boost at level 2 or Divine Blessing at level 2. Finally for the set bonus you'll have the Safijiva's Seal, True Dragon Vein Awakening. This is a buff that kicks in whenever we have our weapon drawn. With our weapon drawn, you'll gain increased base affinity as well as increased elemental damage. But there is a downside to this. With each swing of the weapon, regardless of if you hit a monster or not, it will drain our health, leaving a red portion of health on our health bar. So this can leave us at risk at carting, but should you be accurate with your attacks and they hit, after a certain number of attacks, the True Dragon Vein Awakening will initiate a heal, healing us for the health it drained. So as you can see, there's the risk reward factor here. But nonetheless, if you've got a large collection of KR weapons or elemental weapons, this is a build to consider, especially if you like to counter monsters with the various elements in the game. But of course there are pros and cons to every build out there. The biggest pro for this build is its high elemental damage, able to take down monsters incredibly quickly, so long as you're using the right element against them. On top of that, this build has quite a few quality of life and defensive skills, from evade window, health boost, blight resistance and more. These all add to a quality of a hunt and make it feel easier than it is. And then finally for the pros is the True Dragon Vein Awakening buff, which grants us increased DPS for simply having our weapon drawn. But of course there are cons to every build. The two major cons for this build include the True Dragon Vein Awakening health drain, which can potentially leave you at risk. This is countered slightly thanks to the health regen augmentation, but it's something you need to be aware of. And the other con is, again, this build may have sharpness issues unfortunately. But regardless, like I said, if you have a large collection of elemental weapons and you like to use them against monsters to take them down quickly, I can strongly recommend this build. It's fun to use, I love the risk reward set bonus, and it enables you to deal high amounts of elemental damage. Which brings us on the third build, which is normally a niche or quirky build, which is the best of the best support sword and shield build. The sword and shield is in a very unique place, as it's a weapon that can still use potions and other consumables without having to sheath the weapon. Thus it can make it one of the best support weapons in the game, as you're able to quickly drink that potion, heal yourself and your allies without having to take the time to stop, sheath your weapon and then use the potion. So this build is all about survivability, keeping yourself and your team alive. So for this build you'll need the Kulftaroth's Fury Beta, the Kulftaroth's Ire Beta, Kulftaroth Rage Beta, Dragon Barbs Beta and Kulftaroth's Wrath Beta. For my charm I'm using the Friendship Charm 5 and for my weapon I'm using the Light Break Sword. This has a health regen augmentation and then an augmentation of your choice, to which I've gone for an Ailment Up augmentation. As for the specialist tools, these are again down to personal preference, so I've gone for Rocksteady and Temporal Mantles, but to be honest I probably should have replaced them to the Health and Cleanser booster, but they are optional at the end of the day. So when it comes to the jewels, you've got a few to play around with. First of all, I've gone for Blast Jewels to max out the blast attack of this build. I've then gone for a Shaver Jewel for Clutch Claw boost, Earplug Jewels for the Earplug skill, Fortitude Jewel for the Fortify skill, Sharp Jewels for Protected Polish, Tenderizer Jewels for Weakness Exploit, Medicine Jewels for the Recovery Up skill, Sated Jewels to max out the Free Meal skill, Expert Jewels for some Critical Eye, and finally Vitality Jewels for the Health Boost skill. As for the jewels and the mantles, I've gone for Expert Jewels for some more Critical Eye. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with 150 health, 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant consumables. You have a raw attack of 441 with a chunk of purple sharpness, your 20% base affinity, which can be potentially 70% when you take into account weakness exploit. You have a blast ailment rating of 320 with a strong defense of 1105, strong against fire and thunder, but weak to the other elements. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have Earplugs at level 5, Earplugs is a wonderful quality of life skill that allows you to ignore all monster roars in the game. We've mainly taken this as we don't want to be interrupted by roars when we're taking potions to heal ourselves and our allies. Next up is Wide Range at level 5. This is the quintessential support skill in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Basically, whenever we consume a potion or other item, the effects will be passed on to our allies. So ultimately, when you drink a mega potion, our allies will also feel the effect of that mega potion. You also have Blast Attack at level 4, increasing the blast rating and thus the build-up of the ailment. You also have Critical Eye at level 4, which can be potentially level 6 when we're wearing our mantles. You have Health Boost at level 3, Recovery Up level 3. Recovery Up is a skill that increases the effectiveness of healing potions and such. You have Critical Boost level 3, Weakness Exploit level 3, Free Meal at level 3. Free Meal is a skill that gives us an increased chance at not consuming a potion or other item when we actually use them. So it ultimately reduces the amount of times we have to go back to camp to stock up on potions and that. You also have Speed Eating at level 3, which increases the time that we consume potions and that, so basically we're drinking them like they're shots, reducing the animation time needed to drink those said potions, which ultimately allows us to get back into the fight or consume other items to heal or buff our allies. You also have Fortify at level 1, Protected Polish at level 1, and finally Clutch Claw Boost at level 1. Finally, for the set bonus, you have two of them, both attached to the Kulftaroth Essence. For wearing 2 pieces of the Kulftaroth armor, you'll get the Guts skill. This is a skill that puts a little marker on our health bar. This marker is around the 25% mark. Now, as long as our health is above that said marker, should we take a hit from a monster that would normally cart us, then we will be left alive with 1 HP. The Guts buff will then disappear. And then for wearing 4 pieces of the Kulftaroth armor, you'll have the Free Meal secret, allowing us to get the Free Meal skill from level 1 to level 3, greatly increasing the chance of not consuming an item when we use it. So as you can see, that is the best of the best support sword and shield build. As I said, it's focused more on keeping yourself and your allies alive rather than dealing damage to a monster. It does have some damage options thanks to having blast attack as well as weakness exploit and crit boost, but nonetheless your main focus and priority is to keep yourself and your allies alive with your potions. But of course there are pros and cons to every build. The biggest pro for this build is its support capabilities, easily able to consume potions quickly and effectively to heal yourself and your allies. On top of that, the next pro is the quality of life options available to this build. From earplugs to health boost, recovery up, and the guts set bonus, these all help add to the quality of a hunt, making harder hunts feel more survivable. Then finally for the pros is that this build is actually not too difficult to craft. You could probably build a very similar build by using the full Fatalis armor set in all honesty, but I also wanted to demonstrate something that wasn't using the Fatalis armor that could be still classed as a best of the best build. But unfortunately there are cons to every build. The 2 biggest cons for this build is unfortunately your damage output is slightly lacking. It's not the worst out there, you can still deal a decent amount of damage to a monster, but you're not going to be hitting the hardest with this build. And unfortunately the other con is we only have a small portion of purple sharpness which you can burn through pretty quickly despite having protected polish on this build. Nonetheless, if you're looking for a build to play with others, you'd like to take on the role of a support hunter, then I can strongly recommend this build. It's able to keep you alive and your friends alive easily, allowing you to take on even the most difficult hunts in the game. Which brings us on to the 4th and final build, which is the best of the best Guiding Lands Sword and Shield build. This build is very similar to the first build featured in this video, but instead it's been augmented to take on the Guiding Lands effectively and efficiently. So for this build, you'll need the Bracken DM Helm beta, the Dragon Hide beta, Dragon Claws beta, Dragon Barbs beta, and Dragon Feet beta. I'm also using a Challenger Charm 5, and for my weapon I'm using the True Fatalis sword. This has a health regen augmentation and then attack increase augmentation. As for the specialist tools, as always, these are down to personal preference. So when it comes to the jaws, you've got a lot to play around with here, and this is where the main differences in the 2 builds come into play. First of all, I've gone for Destroy Jaws for the Part Breaker skill. I've then gone for Protection Jaws for Divine Blessing, Critical Jaws for Crit Boost, Expert Jaws for Critical Eye, Evasion Jaws for Evade Window, Challenger Jaws for the Agitated skill, Handicraft Jaw for some Handicraft, a Hard Geology Jaw for the Geologist skill, Attack Jaws for the Attack Boost skill, and a Fortitude Jaw for the Fortify skill. Again, as for the jaws on the mantles, they're down to personal preference, but I've gone for Dragon Jaws for the Dragon Attack skill. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 200 health and 200 stamina, regardless of if you've taken consumables or not. You have a raw attack of 547 with a decent chunk of purple sharpness. You have 15% base affinity, which can potentially be 85% when you take into account both the buff from Agitator as well as weakness exploit. You have a dragon rating of 120 with high Elder Seal, and you have a strong defense of 1111 that is strong against water and thunder, slightly weak to fire and ice, but unfortunately very weak to dragon. So when it comes to the skills, they're very similar to the first build, although there are a few key differences. So you have attack boost at level 7, you have critical eye at level 7, agitator at level 7, evade window at level 5, divine blessing at level 5, critical boost at level 3, weakness exploit at level 3, Heartbreaker at level 3. Heartbreaker is an essential skill for the Guiding Lands. The skill itself allows us to break monster body parts more easily, but when it comes to the Guiding Lands, it also allows us to break off monster materials from their bodies more easily and more often, ultimately allowing us to get more loot from the endgame area. You also have Geologist at level 3. Geologist really only needs to be at level 1 when it comes to Guiding Land builds, but as the Jewel sockets allowed, we might as well get it to level 3. Geologist is a skill that allows us to loot the monster materials that we break off of them twice instead of once, at least from the high tier monsters. On top of that, Geologist at level 3 allows us to mine and pick up bones from the mining nodes and bone piles additional times, leading to more loot. You also have Handicraft at level 2, Fortify at level 1, and finally when you're wearing your mantles you have Dragon Attack at level 2. As for the set bonus, you have both the Fatalis Legends set bonus, which includes the Inheritance set bonus and Transcendence set bonus. So there you have it. As you can see, it's another build that is a jack of all trades build, having high DPS, high survivability and more. On top of that, it has everything you need to farm the endgame Guiding Lands effectively and efficiently. But even this build has pros and cons. The biggest pro for this build is its strong DPS output, able to take on pretty much any monster in the game thanks to having such high raw attack and not relying on elements or ailments. On top of that, the next pro is that this build has all the essential skills for farming the Guiding Lands, allowing you to come out of the area with maximum loot. And then finally for the pros is the Fatalis Legends set bonus itself, which ultimately increases our defense, DPS and quality of life. But unfortunately, as with every build, there are cons. One of the biggest cons for this build is unfortunately there may be times, especially during prolonged fights, where sharpness becomes an issue, and the other con is, again unfortunately, this is a jewel heavy build requiring some of the rarest jewels and decorations in the game. But regardless, if you're looking for a strong build to take on the Guiding Land, say you want to upgrade other weapons or more sword and shields, then this build I can strongly recommend. You can take on any monster in the Guiding Lands effectively and efficiently, and you don't need to go back to camp to swap out the build. So there you have it. Those are the best of the best builds I use for the Sword and Shield. Now these builds are aimed to be strong general builds able to take on pretty much any task in Monster Hunter World Iceborne, but if you wanted to take on some of the tougher monsters such as Elatrion or Fatalis, then some adjustments may be needed. These builds may be also slightly different from other meta builds found in the community, but regardless, these are the strongest builds that I personally like to use in the game, and I hope they help you out in your hunts too. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you the best of the best builds for the Sword and Shield in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.